So welcome everybody to the Harbor Bible Study. And as I mentioned before I turned on the record button, I am Corey Peacock. I am part of Harbor Church. I am the administrative pastor there, and I have a PhD in Bible. And the reason we are doing this Bible study is because some people at our church wanted to do a Bible study. And so we're going to do that. As I just mentioned, we're going to run in this cycle of about 6 weeks of doing Bible study and then take 2 or 3 weeks off, and then we will start again. And that's the way this is going to go. So this is a good old-fashioned Bible study where we are digging into the Word on a weekly basis. We have the long run in mind so that we are trying to grow in the Word over an extended period of deep and reflective study. There will be times when we go quickly through the biblical text. There will be times when we go very slow through the biblical text. There will be no kind of official agenda. What I'm going to do is set a kind of a course of direction and a speed, but we're going to be flexible as you express what you want to see out of this, as I try and bring things to the table that are interesting, I think. So you're here on a Monday night at 6 p.m., and we're going to try and keep to this idea of meeting from 6 to 7 sharp. I'm kind of envisioning this as like a replacement or addition to like a good old-fashioned Sunday school where, you know, you'd show up and you had to end on time so that you could go to the Sunday morning meeting. So in general, I'm going to sign off at 7. And you can stick around and talk, but I will be gone at that point. There will be times I'll stick around afterwards for more general discussion. But as a general practice, we're going to run from 6 to 7, and that will be the focused time on the Bible study. We will have someone watching the chat, which will typically be my wife, which is Pastor Amy Jacober, and she is the pastor of Harbor Church. For those of you who do not know, she is our lead pastor. And I'm going to have to put one pause because we live in the real world. My daughter is doing dance right around the corner. So pause for 1 second. Real world, everyone. All right. So Amy will be watching the chat. And so if you are not in a position to ask a question that kind of feels natural to what we're doing, but you don't want to lose your question, drop your questions in the chat. Amy will be watching them and she will make sure to raise those questions as it's appropriate. This thing is optional. So come late, leave early, do what fits your schedule. There's no guilt or pressure here. This is just all for our own betterment and diving into it. So how is this supported? And I know there's a lot of prologue here, but I just want to get this all out of the way. I'm doing this, I'm giving of my time to do a church Bible study. So therefore, this is, even though it's going to go on the internet and all that stuff, it's going to be free forever. And because it's free, that means I'm probably going to rely heavily on my 20 plus years in the field and a little bit less on weekly preparation. I will, of course, do weekly preparation, but I'm going to have to keep it limited due to the amount of things we all have to do in our busy lives. Like I said, this will be free, but if you ever want to help out financially, or you just enjoy the work of what Harbor Church is trying to do, there will be a PayPal, but I do not want to focus on that. This is just for everyone to show up and dive into the Bible. And to be clear, if you ever donate to Harbor Church because of this Bible study, that money will go to, you can designate it specifically for the Bible study so that we can do things like buy commentaries or things like that to prepare it, but the money will never go to me. And I just want that on the record so you all know, because some of you don't know me. Last couple of points before we just dive in. This is kind of an in-person virtual Bible study, but it will be recorded, as I've mentioned. So in general, please remain on mute unless you're about to talk. We will be recording every session. And what I'm going to do after that is very lightly edit it and then post it on YouTube. So I kind of would like to say your presence here and your participation here suggests that you are okay with this going on the internet. And if you don't want to, you can turn your cameras off or you can watch it at a later time. But I also would encourage you to think that having your face on the camera for all of us to look at one another is a real positive thing. We get to see the way Scripture is hitting other people, and we get to interact with that. So our faces on the cameras might be a very good thing. Lastly, and I've kind of, in my preparation notes, called this the rules. But as I said, low key. We are trying to build here an environment that is steeped in inquisitiveness and respect. So we can question something that I say or somebody else says, but kindness is mandatory. And presuming the positive intent of someone else is also mandatory. We presume positive intent and earnest reflection. So questions, disagreement, and challenging ideas are all acceptable, but we just want to do so kindly in honoring of the other people in the room. This will be, you've heard the term before, I'm sure, a safe space. It will be a brave space for us to put forth our ideas and share them in a space where you know it's going to be okay to talk about something. And so for all of those things that I've launched in with, I'm going to ask for the first time of, I presume, lots of times, does anyone have any comments, questions, or snide remarks? I'll hold and wait for a moment or two.
I'm excited. That was my comment.
That's your comment.
Same.
Thanks, Alicia.
And thank you.
You bet.
Yes, thank you very much, Corey.
Yeah. I'm trying to find a way to make my screen smaller so I can see my notes and as many of you as possible at the same time. There we go. Well, let's begin. Let's just go ahead and do this. I have called this first 6-week session Season 1 Genesis. And to be clear, we're not going to get through Genesis in 6 weeks. We're going to get through almost 6 chapters. And part of that, I will say, is because the beginning of the biblical text is really dense on one hand. And the second thing is that it's full of stories that we all know or think we know or kind of know but want to know better. And so I think as we're setting the big picture in mind at the beginning of this session, it's important to go slow. Now, I promise you, when we get to Exodus at some point in time, there will be chapters to skip. But right now, we're going to go slow through these first few chapters. So let me tell you a little bit about the Bible. The Bible, as we have it as Protestant Christians, we have 2 testaments. What we all know as the New Testament, and then the Old Testament, which is also known as the Hebrew Bible. Now, as Protestants, those are the 2 testaments that we have. Catholics and Eastern Orthodox Christians have an apocrypha that they utilize, but that's not something that Protestants typically engage in for religious instruction. The Old Testament, as I mentioned, is known as the Hebrew Bible, and this Hebrew Bible is what the Jews use for their religious practices. And the Hebrew Bible and Old Testament are effectively identical. Now, they're not exactly identical. They're almost identical. A couple of differences between a Hebrew Bible and an Old Testament are The order of the books is slightly different. So for instance, in the Old Testament, the book of Ruth comes after, is it Judges? Or is it before Judges? Right in there. In the Hebrew Bible, it comes very much closer to the end of the Hebrew Bible. Chronicles is in a different space. Importantly, the Old Testament, the Christian Old Testament, ends with Malachi. And it ends with this notion that there will be this a waiting period expecting a Messiah. The Hebrew Bible has it in a different order, so that's not how the Hebrew Bible ends. That's one of the major differences, is the book order difference. There are a couple of other differences that are primarily about, verses are different. Like sometimes the verses are a little bit off. This happens a lot in the Psalms. So if you look at almost any Psalm, they're almost always off by one verse. And that's simply because of the way they do the title of a Psalm. In English, we take that title and put it as like a subtitle to the Psalm, and then we begin with verse 1. But that verse 1 is, in the Hebrew Bible, verse 2. So they're often just off by one verse. Not a big deal, and almost never makes any sort of difference to us for our purposes. But that's an important thing for you to know, that if I say verse 15 and I start reading something and you look at it and think, that's not verse 15, you might just raise your hand and say, is this one of those places where it's different in the Hebrew Bible and the Old Testament? Because just out of practice, I always use the Hebrew Bible as my versing way of looking at the text. Okay, so Hebrew Bible and Old Testament are virtually the same. So the Hebrew Bible and Old Testament have 3 sections. The Hebrew Bible is broken up into Torah, which is the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible, which is Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And that's the first chunk. Then it has what's known as the prophets. And the prophets are slightly different order, but in general, the prophets are broken up into 2 different groups, which are known as the former prophets. And the former prophets is basically all the history books that we think of, right? The books of Samuel and Kings. It tells the story of Israel from the time they become a monarchy until the time they go into exile. Now, if any of this is going too quickly for you, drop some questions in the text and I'll come back to it. But our main point here is not history. We will get to history later. I'm just trying to fly by the overarching things of the Bible. So the prophets, like I said, broken up into 2 parts. The former prophets, which is history, and the latter prophets, which are the prophets that we think of in prophecy, right? Ezekiel, Isaiah, and Jeremiah, Amos, Hosea, and stuff like that. So, Leisha, I see your hand.
Sorry.
Yeah,
The Torah is the first 5 books. What's the former prophets called?
They're called the former prophets. So it's like Joshua, Judges, Samuel, Kings.
Right. But the Hebrew word you said?
Oh, Nevi'im.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. Let's see if I can type that really quickly.
Yeah. So Corey, type it, but it's also, and so most of you on here I know. And so super fun to see so many people. And I feel like we're quasi back at an Elevate training with some new friends, which is awesome. But so Leisha is a part of Harbor and she's incredible at asking questions, which is great. So you're in the corner here, Leisha. If you're wondering why I'm looking weird, I'm actually looking at you on my screen now. When Corey talks about Tanakh, that Torah and the Nevi'im, it's the N. And so just know that you've already been exposed to some of this. He just doesn't do it in kind of quite the same way when we're just doing regular church.
So I've just typed in the chat a few things that will help us as we're moving forward. So we're in this Nevi'im part, which is the prophets. And as I mentioned, the former prophets are like Joshua, Judges, Samuel, Kings. That's all the history. Then what's known as the latter prophets are all the prophets we think of who do prophecy, right? Isaiah, Jeremiah, Hosea, Amos, etc. And that makes up the whole body of the prophets. Then there's what's known as the Ketuvim, which is the writings. And those kind of are just a collection of all the things that didn't fit in the first two places. And there's a reason for that, and I'll talk about that at some other time. But that's the third major section. And so there's lots of different kinds of biblical books in that space. There's the Psalms, the Proverbs, Lamentations. In the Hebrew Bible, the books of Chronicles go there. So that looks like history, but it goes in the writing section. Jonah, Daniel, those kinds of books. And that's what makes up the writings. Now, as we get to those books, we will explore the prophets and the writings more deeply. But we're going to focus here on Torah. So Torah is the 5 books that tell the story of the world from creation through Israel's re-entry into and down into Egypt, and then back up out of Egypt into Israel. So that's what Torah is doing. There's a lot of laws in Torah. There's a lot of things that describe how Israel is supposed to be Israel, and we will get to that. So I've started from the Bible. I moved to the Old Testament. I talked about how the Old Testament is divided into 3 spots. And now we're focusing on that first spot, which is Torah. And then within Torah, we're now going to focus in on Genesis. So what is Genesis? Was there a question?
Yes.
Please.
Do we know why Protestant Christians don't include the Apocrypha in our practice of religion?
We do. We do know. And part of it comes down to a fairly simple point, which is that Martin Luther, among other reformers who left the Catholic Church, when they decided what they wanted the Bible to look like as they were moving forward, they decided that most of the material in the Apocrypha was not terribly valuable for religious instruction. Not that it was not valuable, but that it was not valuable for religious instruction about how to live. That it was more helpful as background material. And so they said, let's not put that in our Bible. Let's set it aside. And so that's why they did that. Okay. And that's, in one sense, it's really kind of as simple as that.
So Corey?
Yes.
And I think this will tie in. Jim had asked a little bit earlier, so why the different order? And you touched on that because it's about, as Christians, the order is really about setting us up for the coming of the Messiah. But then Leisha's also going, wait a minute, what's an Apocrypha?
Okay.
So,
right. So the Apocrypha, I don't want to linger on it too much, but it's about, I think there are 2 different sizes of the Apocrypha, because the Catholic Church uses one Apocrypha and the Eastern Orthodox Church uses a different Apocrypha, which has, I think, a couple of additional books. This is not my specialty, but I do know some of the books, and they can be really, really fascinating. There are books like Tobit or Maccabees, and some of them are about history, and some of them are folk tales with a lesson. And so that's part of that whole idea that they were interesting and important, but not for religious instruction. And so there are a whole bunch of books that you will find in Catholic Bibles that don't occur in Protestant Bibles. Okay. We can explore some more of this later. It doesn't affect much of what we're doing for Torah, so we won't linger at this moment. So let me give you an overview of Genesis. Genesis is, well, it's often people's favorite book because it's at the beginning, it's interesting, it's big, it's bold, it's exciting. And so what Genesis covers is more or less a history of creation up until Israel goes down into Egypt. Now, there's lots of moving in the middle of that, but what it is covering is, let's see, there are two main sections. There's chapters 1 through 11, and then chapters 12 through 50. And 12 through 50 can be subdivided several times, and we'll break that down later. Chapters 1 through 11 are known as, let's see, largely it's known as mythology. Now, I want to be very clear with what I mean by when I say mythology. The popular idea of mythology is that it means they're just kind of fake little stories and they're not real. That's not the kind of idea that I'm talking about. Mythology, as I am using it here, is a technical term. Okay, so mythology means stories about first things. How did things come to be the way they are? And it has a particular style as well. That is, characters tend to be very flat. Okay, by which I mean most characters are not the robust, multi-layered, characters that we have nowadays, like angsty superheroes, or even side characters who have massive backstories or whatever it is, right? Everybody in modern stories is really robust and fully fleshed out human beings and stuff like that. In mythology, they tend to be very linear, very flat, not a lot of psychological depth. Okay, that's where you get a lot of these stories where their name represents their entire character. And that's what mythology does as a genre, the way its style. The third thing about mythology that I would want you to know is that the settings are often nebulous. They're not always clear what the setting is. It's just kind of some place, and you just kind of assume that these characters are there interacting with one another. So this is a technical term that has nothing to do with truth value, nothing to do with historicity or anything, but a description of the type of literature that we would be reading in Genesis 1 through 11.
So I just want to make that really, really abundantly clear, because this is something Corey and I have both been nailed on in both graduate and undergraduate teaching. Inevitably, there'll be somebody who's been raised in the church and we'll say something about myth and they're like, oh, you don't even believe in God? Oh my gosh, you think that this is just a fairy tale, a myth, a story? And we're like, no, it's a genre. So importantly, myth is a genre. It is not a theological declaration that this is all made up. Cool?
Awesome. So let me set it in a different type of context now for a moment. I'm going to give you one more brief flyby thing here. And again, it's so hard to start these things because there's so much ramp up to give you the context you need to know in order to understand what's going on. So let me tell you about history. At least the history that doesn't pertain to what's going on in Genesis. This will make sense in a moment. At some point, there is an Israelite kingdom. That's the kingdom that David and Solomon and all those kings rule. And at some point in time, the biblical bad guys, the Assyrians and the Babylonians, come in and they take the Israelites from their home and they take them to Assyria, roughly in 720 BCE, before Jesus. And in about 586, the Babylonians come and take the Judahites, the southern Israelites, and they take them to Babylon. And that's kind of the background. The reason this is important is because Genesis is written in the context of these Judahites living in Babylon and engaging with the Babylonians. And we will see this a little bit today in the second half of this Bible study as we start to engage Genesis 1. Now, how do we know it's written in the exile? Well, there are some really long, academic debates about this. But in short, we find that the portion of Genesis that we're going to focus on tonight was written by what's known as a priestly source. Okay. So one of the prevailing ideas for how the Bible was written, or how Torah was written, was that there were kind of four major sources and somehow they came together. It's a very complicated idea, but the simple part of it is you had different traditions in Israel, and somebody said these traditions belong together. And one of those traditions was known as the priestly source. And the final form of the priestly source really does show a lot of evidence of having been written in dialogue with Judahites, Israelites in Babylon. Now, there's a long history that precedes it. So some of these ideas had been around for hundreds of years, but the final form of the text that we have looks like it is roughly from 600 to 500 BCE. Okay. So let's talk about creation stories. I would like to start with a creation story that I am pretty sure you don't know. So I'm going to share my screen, and we are going to look at a creation story that is not from the Bible, but I want you to see it because it's neat. So let me find the right button. All right, I'm hopeful you can see this text. All right. This is what's known as the Babylonian creation epic. It is many, many tablets long. I don't know how many off the top of my head. There are also many versions of it, so some of them are longer than others. But the version I'm showing you is one of the better known versions of it. And so I'm going to read some of this to you. Not much, but some, because I want you to see some things. It begins, when on high. And those two words are what give this creation epic its name. It's known as Enuma Elish. Enuma, when, Elish, on high. When on high, no name was given to heaven, nor below was the netherworld called by name. Primeval Apsu was their progenitor, and matrix Tiamat was she who bore them all. They were mingling their waters together. No canebrake was intertwined, nor thicket matted close. When no gods at all had been brought forth, none called by names, none destinies ordained, then were the gods formed with these two. This is the very beginning here. So what it's setting up for us is, before there was anything, there were these two gods, Apsu and Tiamat. And Apsu is kind of known as the fresh water god. He is the fresh waters that kind of flow through the region. And Tiamat is the mother who bore everyone. So this just sets up a context of, before anything, there were these two gods. Now, resuming in line 10, Lachmu and Lachamu were brought forth, were called by name. When they had waxed great, had grown up tall, Anshar and Kishar were formed greater than they. They grew lengthy of days, added years to years. Okay, so first generation of kids are born, God kids, right? They're born. Anu, their firstborn, was like his forebearers. Anu is the sky god, the kind of the big god that happens through much of Babylonian theology. Anshar made Anu his offspring. Now, I'm going to skip a little bit further down. Here we go. Roughly line 21. Here we go. The divine brethren banded together, confusing Tiamat as they moved about in their stir, roiling the vitals of Tiamat, by their uproar distressing the interior of the divine abode. What they're doing is they're saying the kids are noisy and loud and they're bothering mom. Okay. Apsu could not reduce their clamor. Dad couldn't get him quiet. But Tiamat was silent before them. Their actions were noisome to her. Their behavior was offensive, but she was indulgent. And therefore, Apsu, the begetter of the gods, summoned Mumu, his vizier, saying to him, Mumu, vizier who contents me, come, let us go to Tiamat. And they went and they took their place facing her, and they spoke and they said to her, their behavior is noisome to me. By day I have no rest. At night I do not sleep. I wish to put an end to their behavior, to go away with it. Let silence reign that we may sleep. And when Tiamat heard this, she grew angry and cried out and said, no. Now I'm going to pause there. Basically, the dad went to the mom and said, they're noisy, they're bothering me, I'm going to take care of it. And she's like, no, don't do it. Now, I'm not going to read much more from there because what I want to do is summarize from that point on. Apsu, dad, goes and tries to take care of it. He tries to go and he makes a plan basically to kill his children gods. Pleasant stuff, I know. But there's this one particular god, and I don't know if I'll find it quickly. Here we go, line 60. The god Ea was aware of all and recognized their stratagem, their plan to kill all the gods. He fashioned it, established it, a master plan. He made it artful, his superb magic spell, and he recited it and he did all this stuff. And then in line 65, he made Apsu sleep, drenched in slumber. Mumu, the advisor, was drowsy with languor. He untied his sash, stripped off his tiara. He took away his aura. He put it on himself. He tied up Apsu and killed him. So dad wants to kill the children gods. One of the children gods goes, whoa, bad plan. And so he kills the dad god. So what happens after that? I'm going to summarize really briefly. Mom god, Tiamat, gets upset. So she basically tries the same thing that Apsu just tried. And this time, instead of Ea, a different god named Marduk comes to the fore, and he stops Tiamat by killing Tiamat, mom god. Now, what's really interesting then is he uses her body to make the cosmos and the stars and the foundation of the earth upon which to build his temple. So we're going to stop there with this Enuma Elish creation epic. What do I want you to take with that? Why do I find that that was worth, 5 to 10 minutes of our time? Well, one of the main things I want you to notice is this motif of chaos that needs to be fixed and transferred into order. So there's chaos and people try to put it in order. And sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't, right? So Apsu is trying to make order of the chaos of the noisy children, and it fails because Ea stops him. There's chaos some more, and then Tiamat tries to stop it, and Marduk stops Tiamat from bringing order. But in the midst of stopping one kind of order, Marduk establishes his own order. And Marduk is the main god of Babylon in the 6th century. He's one of many, but he's one of the main gods. And so one of the things this story is telling is about how Babylon is becoming the dominant power in the region. Their God is becoming the one who provides order, which provides a justification for Babylon to provide order for the world. Or at least that's the argument that they are making. Okay. There are other motifs of killing family members, as I talked about. There's the rise of political machinery. part of Marduk coming to the fore here is how he puts political things in order. He raises up a priesthood. He puts all the officers and viziers in order, and then Marduk becomes in charge. Overall, this is about a order coming out of chaos and Marduk's ascendancy as the main point that this creation epic is trying to make. And in the midst of all of that, it is highly astrological. That is, lots of gods are mentioned that are primarily showing us who is in charge. There's Shamash, the sun god. There is Sin, which is the moon god. And the whole thing is ritually centered in the idea that if you do all these rituals, the gods will be pleased. Now, I just read you the very beginning of it, and it goes on and on and on. But it's fascinating if you can kind of peel back the layers of the highly formulaic language. So I showed that as part of a backdrop. Let's finally turn our attention to Genesis 1. Genesis 1 is not interested in what's happening in heaven, so to speak. And Genesis 1 is largely known as an anti-mythological text, despite kind of being in the genre of mythology. So what I would like us to do is take a moment and read Genesis 1. And to save my voice, because Leisha, I see you there, you're on the top of my screen.
I knew it was coming to me. I knew it was.
I appreciate it. Can you read Genesis 1 for us? I will put it on the screen.
Absolutely.
If I can find where it is. There we go. It might be small, so I don't know if you can see that.
Yeah, I can see it.
Very good.
I'm going to have to get closer.
If you can read the English, not the Hebrew.
Well, I can't read the Hebrew, so.
Oh, okay.
In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was formless and void, and darkness was over the surface of the deep. And the Spirit of God was moving over the surface of the waters. Then God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. God saw that the light was good, and God separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And there was evening, and there was morning, one day. Then God said, "Let there be an expanse in the midst of the waters, and let it separate the waters from the waters." God made the expanse and separated the waters which were below the expanse from the waters which were above the expanse, and it was so. God called the expanse heaven, and there was evening and there was morning, a second day. Then God said, "Let the waters below the heavens be gathered into one place, and let dry land appear," and it was so. God called the dry land earth, and the gathering of the waters he called seas, and God saw that it was good. Then God said, "Let the earth sprout vegetation, plants yielding seed and fruit trees on the earth bearing fruit after their kind with seed in them," and it was so. The earth brought forth vegetation, plants yielding seed after their kind, and trees bearing fruit with seed in them after their kind, and God saw that it was good. Then there was evening and there was morning, a third day.
I'm going to scroll up now.
Okay, go for it.
There we go.
Then God said, "Let there be lights in the expanse of the heavens to separate the day from the night, and let them be for signs and for seasons and for days and years. And let them be for lights in the expanse of the heavens to give light on the earth," and it was so. God made the two great lights, the greater light to govern the day, and the lesser to govern the night. He made stars also. God placed them in the expanse of the heavens to give light on the earth, and to govern the day and the night, and to be separate, and to separate the light from the darkness. And God saw that it was good. There was evening and there was morning, a fourth day. Then God said, "Let the waters teem with swarms of living creatures, and let birds fly above the earth in the open expanse of the heavens." God created the great sea monsters and every living creature that moves, with which the waters swarmed after their kind, and every winged bird after its kind. And God saw that it was good. God blessed them, saying, "Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the waters and the seas, and let birds multiply on the earth." Then there was evening and there was morning, a fifth day. Then God said, "Let the earth bring forth living creatures after their kind, cattle and creeping things and beasts of the earth after their kind." And it was so. God made the beasts of the earth after their kind, and the cattle after their kind, and everything that creeps on the ground after its kind. And God saw that it was good. Then God said, "Let us make man in our image, according to our likeness, and let them rule over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the sky, and over the cattle, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth." God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. God blessed them, and God said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth and subdue it, and rule over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the sky, and over every living thing that moves on the earth."
Scrolling again.
Go for it. Then God said, "Behold, I have given you every plant yielding seed that is on the surface of the earth, and every tree which has fruit yielding seed. It shall be food for you. And to every beast of the earth, and to every bird of the sky, and to every living thing that moves on the earth which has life, I have given every green plant for food." And it was so. God saw all that he had made, and behold, it was very good. And there was evening, and there was morning, the sixth day. Thus the heavens and the earth were completed, and all their hosts. By the seventh day, God completed his work which he had done, and he rested on the seventh day from all the work which he had done. Then God blessed the seventh day and sanctified it, because in it he rested from all his work which God had created and made.
Go ahead and stop there for a second.
Yep.
So I'm going to actually read the next half verse. So Genesis 2:4, the first half. So that's known as A. This is the account of the heavens and the earth when they were created. And most people think that that's where the first creation story chunk ends. So it's chapter 1 plus the first 3.5 verses of chapter 2. So before I say anything, does anyone have anything about this passage based on some of the background I've given, perhaps?
I did, but I'm still writing. So somebody go first.
I always like how the creation story in the Bible is very like melodic, and I'm sure in Hebrew it's even prettier, but it sounds very song-like, and it has like a rhythm. Each of their kind, and in its kind, and it kind of has these like repetitive themes to it.
Yeah.
But what I notice in contrast to the Babylonian like story that you read us, so this one was like violence is how everything started, right? And this one, it's creation is how everything starts, and it's like very pretty and kind of flowery, I guess, and poetic, as opposed to like, this was chaotic and so we're gonna kill him. It's a much more, I guess, romantic and fairy tale like beginning. So that was what I noticed in contrast.
Yeah, that's a good point. At the very beginning, there is a notion of chaos in this one, but it's not chaos that's centered on violence, as you say, right? That verse 2, it says, "And the earth was," formless and void is the typical English translation, but it's really kind of hard to say exactly what the words mean in Hebrew. Formless and void is good enough, right? It's like it was some sort of roiling mess. And it talks about the Spirit of God hovering over the waters. You might have noticed also how at some point in time, there was this split, just like I mentioned in Enuma Elish, where there's the upper expanse and the lower expanse, right? The same thing, but again, in a creative act instead of a destructive act. So that's a really fascinating way of depicting this. I will, pardon me. I will add that the very first word of the biblical text is really interesting. In Hebrew, it's the word bereshit. And in a lot of English texts, we translate that as in the beginning. I'm sure you've all heard exactly that phrase. The Hebrew seems to suggest a slightly different translation. And you will get this if you look at, for instance, the Jewish Publication Society, the JPS Hebrew Bible. It says, when God began to create. So it's when, in beginning to create is what it basically is trying to say. In beginning to create, God's creating of something, right? Which is different, isn't it? It implies a whole different context as a background to this story. In fact, many of the early rabbis didn't think that this was talking about the beginning of all time. This was just the beginning of the part that relates to us. Like God somehow has been around and doing all these things. And this is the beginning of God creating this heaven and earth. In fact, there are lots of rabbis who talk about this specific idea that as it goes through and says, God created this and it was good. God created this and it was good. God created this and it was good. That was evidence that he created other things and went, not so good. Let's try again. And so this one was the attempt that stuck, according to some rabbis. And that's why it's so important to acknowledge that God created this and he evaluated it and said, that's good. Now, who knows, right? But those are some of the stories that come through to us. I will add that if you notice one last thing that we have time for before we kind of put a bow on tonight is Genesis 31 says, God saw all that he had made, and behold, it was very good. And there was evening and there was morning, the sixth day. Thus the heavens and the earth were completed and all their hosts. By the seventh day, God had completed his work, which he had done, and he rested on the seventh day from all his work, which he had done. Genesis 2:2. The reason I point this out is because it emphasizes Sabbath so early in the story. Because as you will note, as we get through this Bible study, the centerpiece of Torah is not Genesis. The centerpiece of all Torah is Exodus, in the Exodus moment. God, when he is describing himself to his people and using his people to describe himself to others, he doesn't talk about being the God of creation. He talks about being the God of the Exodus. I am the God who brought you up out of Egypt. I am the God who brought you from Egypt, delivered you from Egypt. Exodus 20, verse 11, I believe it is. And he says, that is my calling card. So Exodus is the heart of Torah. Genesis is the big story that tells you why everything that happens in Exodus is important. It tells us who all the players are. It tells us what's going on and who has the capability of doing these things. And so we start with a God of creation who is big enough and powerful enough to do it. But even in the creative act of starting this thing, it says, do not forget that this is fundamentally about Sabbath. This is fundamentally about the God who delivered you, O Israelites, from Egypt. That's where we're going to put a pin in it tonight, but it's kind of okay that we stop here because, like I said, this is just an ongoing Bible study. We'll start and stop where we do, and we'll just pick up next week. But before we do, this is that last chance for those questions, comments, or snide remarks.
Yeah, I wanted to make a comment. Oh my gosh.
Please.
So
Yes.
thinking about the Babylonian creation epic, when I saw in the Bible, it saying in verse 26, Genesis, then God said, let us make man in our image and our likeness. I was like, I feel like we saw some of that in this epic. And I was like, okay, all right. And I picked up on it when we were reading that. So I was like, oh my gosh. And then what you said about this being very astrological, I'm noticing the sun and the moon and all the separation and that expanse that you were talking about. But I'm like geeking out over here and probably am not making sense, but there were so many seemingly things that were parallel. I was quite surprised.
Yeah, just wait. I mean, because next week we're going to come back to Genesis 1 and dive into it a little bit more, because I think there's a lot more to look at in Genesis 1. And then we're actually going to look at a couple of other creation stories that we can find in the Bible. What this is a reminder of, like I said, part of the way the Bible was written was gathering these traditions. Well, that meant it gathered traditions of some other things too, like different creation ideas. And so we're going to explore some of those. But before we move on to the other ones, we're going to dive back into Genesis 1 and pull the cover back a little bit more before we go on. There's a lot there.
I had a question.
Yes, please.
Is the Babylonian, when they're in exile there, is that when like Esther was, or is that a different time?
No. So Esther would be even later still.
Okay. So is Babylon when like, is it David? Is like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego? Is that time?
So
I'm trying to place when they were in Babylon. Like
right.
I'm trying to place that.
So they're in Babylon technically from 586 to about the 530s. Some people started going back to Jerusalem shortly thereafter. What happens in the 530s, and this is part of the history that's really important to know, is the kingdom or country, like that's an anachronistic term, but right, Persia comes and defeats Babylon, and Persia takes over. And so Daniel is kind of depicting that transition time between Babylon and Persia, and then Esther is part of the Persian narrative.
That's what I was wondering. So it's like the story of Daniel takes place in Babylon.
Yes.
With what's the king?
Nebuchadnezzar is probably the first one.
Darius, right?
Oh yes, right.
Okay.
So that's the Persian.
All right, cool. I'm with you now. I'm like, but here's where we are on the timeline. Got it.
Exactly. Any other quick questions?
Can I be that person who just makes at least a quick comment? Because as we're kind of doing the shepherding piece, and this is going to be much more Corey. You guys get to hear me preach on Sundays and hear the theological side. So he's doing the Bible side, but especially that beginning piece, if we can begin the shift from in the beginning, which is actually very us-centered, to be able to hear it the way Corey talked about it, and it was as God was creating, that's part of that piece where we can hang on to the eternality of God. God was here long before we were. We don't have to fully understand it, but it does. There's something that's beautiful, especially in a pretty chaotic world right now. If God was able to pull creation and order out of that kind of chaos, then the chaos many of us are experiencing right now that feels impossible to be able to navigate through, how much more can we remember? That was a much harder job than what we've got going now, is what I'm trying to say. I'm not saying it very prettily. I didn't plan it. But if you can hear that, what Corey just described, God is big enough and powerful enough to be able to take something that looked like utter chaos and to be able to create order and sense and community out of that, then that's something that we can lean into. And even the fact that in the midst of crazy COVID, if we had tried this a year ago, y'all would be like, I'm not going to some night Zoom Bible study. But we're like, no, there's enough chaos now. How do we create some order? And we get to have a beautiful community pulled together. So may that be your word of hope for this week. And there's about 1,000 other things that I would like to say about Genesis 1, but my brilliant husband will be able to reflect on that. And I know some of you we haven't seen in a little while. We've had long conversations. We're acutely aware that Genesis 1 has been used, quite frankly, abusively for some of you. It's been used to belittle. It's been used to lift up certain groups of people and to push others down. And so we want this to be a space where we can have those hard conversations as well, but to recognize that every single one of us here have been made in the image of God. All right, there's my pastoral part's done.
Thank you. And just a reminder that we'll pick up with more Genesis 1 next week, and then we're going to start moving into Genesis 2 and beyond. But the other thing is, this was a lot of me talking. It will not always be like this. There will be more opportunity for discussion. Occasionally, we might even break into rooms if that's helpful for us to do, to have smaller groups to talk. But it won't always be me just chatting at you. And there will be time for us to unpack it, because as they say, usually, right, the person who is doing the most talking is doing the most learning. So I learned more than all of you tonight. So, all right. With that in mind, I'm going to leave. I'm going to leave the thing up if any of you would like to stay and chat and get to know one another. And just remember, we're in this for the long haul. So have fun. Leisha, may I leave you as the host?
Sure. Thanks, Corey. You're amazing.
Thank you.
Thanks, Corey.
My pleasure.
Thank you,
Yeah.
Corey.
Thanks.
Corey, do you want to keep the recording on or off?
I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording.
Good plan.